So good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's Kenworth Northeast Training Academy. We appreciate you taking the time out to hop on the call with our friends from Gabriel to take a closer look at the impact shock failures can have on your vehicle's uptime. My name is Melinda, the Director of Marketing here at Kenworth Northeast, and more importantly, we're joined by Michael from Gabriel, who will be leading us through today's session. Usually we've got our cameras and audio off, and we ask that you'll submit your questions through the Q&A button, but we have a relatively small group today, so in a few minutes I'll actually go ahead and give you all the ability to talk while we're going through this to be able to ask questions. You can always use the Q&A as well as we go through the presentation. Just so you know, we got some additional sessions coming up through the end of the year. Let's see, next month, PACCAR and Cummins are going to do a joint session with us to talk about the future of heavy-duty engines. There's a lot of changes coming in 2025 with some regulations coming down the pipe, and then also, as we're all aware in this industry, a lot of knowns and unknowns around electric vehicles. So that should be a very interesting one to bring a lot of questions to, because obviously the engines are the heart of our trucks. Then also following that in October, Bendix is going to be doing a session. They'll be covering their safety systems, and there'll be a lot of interesting stuff to cover there as well. I've also started to put up some of our 2025 first quarter trainings. So if you want to stop, take a look at the website, kenworthme.com/events. You'll be able to find those as they're added as well. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and make our ever so smooth transition to our other slide deck. Give me 1 second here. Okay, Michael, you want to take it away?
Thank you very much. No, we appreciate the opportunity to talk with the customers here, and we appreciate the partnership we have with Kenworth Northeast. So happy to participate here. Welcome, everybody. I know you're all very busy, but we'll get through talking about shocks here reasonably quick. Hopefully you get some information out of here that you'll find useful in your operations. So what is a shock absorber? Technical definition is there, but what I will do is, if you want to go to the next slide there, what I'll do is I'll shorten it for you. It converts mechanical energy received from the suspension into heat energy, which is in turn absorbed by the oil and then dissipated into the atmosphere. So the short version of that is it keeps the tires on the road. Even shorter version of that is the damping in the shock generates heat, which causes misting. That's how it's dissipated into the atmosphere. So a shock has to breathe. You can't consistently put pressure into a tube like that without it exploding. So a shock has to breathe, but it also has to dampen and control the ride and keep the tires on the ground. So overall, there's very long definitions for what it is. A damper, some people call it a damper, but overall it's keeping the tires on the road and managing the ride and the bounce in the vehicle. And it does that by absorbing the heat in the oil within the shock and then dissipating it into the atmosphere. So while that seems a little complicated, it's really not. Let's not get stuck on it, but ultimately you have to know what the shock does and how it works. So the purpose of the shock absorber obviously there is to protect your investment by reducing the wear on tires. If your tires are bouncing down the road, that's going to be a problem. And tires, we all know, are about $700 each. And a shock and an air spring working properly to replace those is probably about $140. So you're probably better off to replace that shock and air spring and keep the tires on the road a little longer. It protects the air springs from pulling apart. The shock is the last line of defense from that air spring pulling apart. So if you've got an air spring that's damaged because it was pulled apart, the reason that happened is because the shock next to it allowed it to happen. So replacing just the air spring is not going to solve your customer's problem. It's going to continue the customer's problem. So the shock has a hydraulic stop in there, which at full extension will stop the shock and the air spring from expanding even further. When that's damaged or not working, that's when you see the air spring damage. So in order to protect the air springs, you want to make sure that your shocks are in good working order. So keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. Obviously, the shocks help with braking effectiveness by keeping the tires on the road. Again, if you're hitting the brakes and the vehicle is going down the road, the suspension plays a big part in stopping that vehicle and controlling the sway and that the weight being shifted to the front. So you want to make sure your suspension's working properly, and when it's not, your braking distances are going to be extended and in some cases get to the unsafe point. So you want your brakes to work properly. You don't want your load shifting. It's very important that your suspension is working properly. Improves vehicle handling, of course, reduces vibration and equipment inside of the vehicle, the cab. So you want to eliminate that as vehicles or trucks get more and more electronics in them. You want to make sure that the ride is as smooth as possible, not bouncing, because a lot of the new equipment is very sensitive to that. It reduces taper leaf spring damage and improves driver comfort. And, one of the things we talk about is how shocks are one of the most overlooked replacement parts because they gradually wear out over time, very similar to brakes. If you get a brand new vehicle, you get acclimated to the brakes, but over time, the vehicle, you just get used to the stopping action of the vehicle. But then you replace the brakes, and the first time you hit them, you're into that steering wheel. Same thing with shocks. You don't really notice it because it's millions of cycles of articulation in the shock. So you don't notice them going bad, but they do go bad over time. And unfortunately, most people don't know how to identify when shocks are actually going bad. So let's jump to the next slide here, and we'll talk about some of the contributors to shock wear failure. First off is high operating temperatures. So uh, in low friction air spring suspensions, they typically operate at higher temperatures, but also where you have continuous weight in a vehicle loaded down and there's not the full articulation of the shock, that will contribute to higher operating temperatures in a shock. And a shock typically operates at about 120 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the type of load that vehicle is moving back and forth. So, the roads, if it's agriculture, mining, or over the road. So, again, it's important to understand what a normal temperature range is for shocks and when it exceeds that as well. Side loads, any shock that's mounted in a 45-degree angle or greater, typically is could experience side load damage to the shock, and those are typically low profile trailers. So those are contributors to shock wear, premature wear on a shock. Poorly maintained air springs, of course, can damage the shocks. So you want to make sure again that the shocks and the air springs are working together in tandem. Corroded pitted piston rods. Again, a rod and a seal will interact, and the rod will go through the seal over 1 million times in the typical lifespan of a shock. So you want to have as smooth a surface as possible on that rod. So again, we use chrome piston rods in ours, and we use it in all of the product that we make for the OEs and our aftermarket product. So again, you want to make sure you're getting a high quality chrome rod in the shock. Loose dust tubes can contribute to shock wear and failure and improper ride height as well. So lots of things can contribute to the shock wear or a premature failure. Now, how do you identify, next slide here, how do you identify worn shocks? So there's some visual cues, and again, leaking, upper lower mount broken, etc. So there's some visual cues there. Leaking's the one I want to hone in on a little bit. Um, the vast majority of shocks will never exhibit any one of these signs over its life. Leaking will only be present in about 5 to 10% of all shocks at any point in their life, even outside of their useful life cycle. So, how do you identify a shock that's bad when it doesn't present any of these signs here? So, first we have to understand what the differences are between misting and leaking, and we can do that here on the next slide. So what you see there on the left is misting. And there's three photos of shocks that have misted. That's a uniform spray pattern on the pressure tube of the shock. And that's normal. That's a normal pattern on a typical shock. Now, those could be, heavy duty. The heavy misting could be the result of a vehicle that's got a lot of articulation, like a vehicle that's doing working in the logging field, the oil patch, agriculture, something like that. But nonetheless, it's not uncommon. That's just telling you that the shock is working properly or was working properly. The leaking you see on the right side, where you see streaks going down the pressure tube of the shock, that is in fact a bad shock. That's where the seal has given way. And a lot of people misidentify misting shocks for bad shocks. Now, misting, again, like I say, that's a normal process in the life of the shock. It has to breathe. We said that in the first slide. Um, so just keep that in mind. Misting is normal, leaking is bad. Now on misting shocks, um, while it doesn't mean that it's a bad shock, you can't tell that it's good or bad by the misting that you see there. So we'll go to the next slide here, which talks about how do you test those shocks, those 90% of shocks that never exhibit a leak or any other one of those 8 characteristics. You can check shocks by doing a heat test. And as we said earlier, shocks operate between 120 and 180 degrees Fahrenheit um, when they're driving over the road for at least 10 minutes, in some cases 10 to 15 minutes. So after that vehicle's coming in, take a look at that shock, hit that shock with a heat gun. If you see that that shock is outside of that temperature range, let's say that it's the same temperature as the frame, and let's say it's an 80-degree day outside, so the frame's 80 degrees, the shock is 80 degrees, that means that the shock is dead. There's no articulation, or I'm sorry, no damping going on in the shock. And as we said in the first slide, damping generates heat, generates misting. So you want to make sure that you test the shocks to understand, are they working or are they not working? And if they're cold, they're old. So shocks do generate heat, and you got to use a heat gun to test them. Now, on all of these slides and on our website, there are videos that are available for you to use and check out that give you more detail on any one of these topics. But you see the QR code on this slide here. That'll take you to a video on this subject and how to test your shocks as well. So, and all of this is also available on our website as well. So keep that in mind. So if it's cold, it's old. You can test the shocks with a heat gun. We used to say grab them, and if they're hot, they're good. We can't do that anymore. People get burned. That's just bad. So we use a heat gun now. Next slide. So here you see the relationship between shocks and air springs. If you're looking at over 1 million cycles on the typical life of a shock, you're also looking at 1 million cycles of the air spring. They work together, they wear together. So that's important to recognize because one, they should be replaced in pairs. Um, Again, to do the job right, you want to make sure that you're replacing both. If your air spring overextended, it's because your hydraulic stop on your shock failed and your shock is bad. So just replacing that air spring is not going to correct your problem, because the next time that suspension overextends, that new air spring's going bad as well. So again, keep that in mind as you're, doing service work on the vehicles. Shocks and air springs should be replaced together and in pairs. So for Kenworth Northeast, on the next slide here, we've got a bunch of product offerings that they have available. They've got the genuine shocks, the OE genuine PACCAR shocks, the OE Plus shocks, TRP hydraulic, TRP gas, and the Fleetline shocks by Gabriel. So all of those are available through Kenworth Northeast. Um, Next slide, please. So again, here's how TRP and Gabriel compare to the competition. So you'll see there's uh, a lot of shocks going over to the Gabriel Gas SLX, which is also the TRP gas shock. That is an adjustable 3-position shock, and it's gas cell. It's not gas charged. There's a difference between that. There's actually a baggie inside of the chamber that has the gas in it. So it's 90% hydraulic fluid, 10% gas bag. The gas and the oil never interact. so there's no aeration in that shock. Um, and because of that, there's a 2-year, 200,000-mile warranty on that shock. So that's the Gabriel Gas SLX, which is also the TRP gas. Um, then we've got the TRP hydraulic shock and the Gabriel Fleetline shock. Those are hydraulic shocks, and those are 90% hydraulic fluid, 10% air. Um, they do have the hydraulic stop, the corrosion-resistant end mounts, fade control, chrome piston rods, and formulated shock oil specific to the application. And again, there's a lot of features that the TRP, Gabriel, and Gas SLX shocks have that our competitors don't have. We do use chrome piston rods in all of our product. Our competitors only use it in their OE product. So we don't believe in cutting corners, and we put it into our product at all levels. So the key advantages of the Fleetline shock on the next slide here is we've got 20% better fade performance. So I'll explain that a little bit in the next slide. We've got the energy absorbing hydraulic stop, which is 8 times better than our competition. And we've got the anti-corrosion end mounts, which prevent the bolts from seizing up in there, which prevents you from having to torch off any of the bolts that get seized up on the old shocks. So we'll go to the next slide, talk a little bit about fade. And when a shock basically comes out of the box, fade performance is 100%. But now as you drive that vehicle down the road and you get that shock up to operating temperature, which is, somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 to 180 degrees, which is where you see the Fleetline and red box there. The left side of that box is the 120, the right side is 180, and then the arrow up and down is 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And you see that the hydraulic shock performs much better, 20% better than our competitor's shock on fade performance over the temperature spectrum of that shock. Now, why is that important? Because fade will cause your ride to be a little softer, and you don't need a softer ride when you're driving a truck. You need that ride to be controlled over the whole distance that truck is driving. As that shock heats up, you want the performance to be consistent, whether it's mile 100 or mile 500 or mile 1000. You want that to be consistent because you don't want to adapt your driving style and change it as the longer the drive goes on. So again, we think that's critically important. Testing has shown that we are in fact 20% better than our competition with regard to fade performance in our shocks. Now the next one here, next slide here, is our hydraulic stop performs better. What that means is the pressures that you put on that shock when you extend it out will certainly perform significantly better than our competition. So what that means is your air springs will not be damaged. There's obviously a point at which the air spring can get damaged, but you have a better chance of keeping those air springs intact with our proprietary hydraulic stop that we put in the shock. On the next slide here, there's a little graphic there on the anti-corrosion end mounts. And again, we put some coating inside of our end mounts that prevents the bolts from seizing up in there. And again, that just makes it easier for you to replace those bolts in the shocks when it comes time to replace them, because you won't have to cut them off. So those are just some of the key advantages of the shocks. There's some additional features of Fleetline shocks on the next page here, or next slide here. Again, three solid steel I-rings, 360-degree reinforced arc welding mounts. So we arc weld that all the way around the top of the shock, as opposed to a 4-point or 8-point weld. We've got the bulge design for additional oil capacity where needed, formulated shock oil, and we always use a larger bore piston. So next slide here. We did talk earlier about the chrome piston rods, and this is a salt spray chamber 96-hour study. This is kind of the industry standard here, and you see that we use our chrome finished rod in ours. And after 96 hours, you see how that chrome finish looks. You see how our competitors' nitrocarburized finish performed in their 60 series and their 65,000 series. We lost the slide. Oh, there it is. And so, yeah, you can see that. Now, which one of those would you want sliding through that seal over 1 million times? Again, I think it's pretty evident that Chrome is the right way to go there. So it's a it's a little more expensive, but we do use it in all of our product. So let's talk a little bit about TRP product on the next slide. Um, there's about 45 or 50 part numbers that are available in TRP. That is PACCAR's private label. Um, it's a great product. A lot of the same features and benefits that the Fleetline product have. It doesn't have a lot of the differences in it are cosmetic, but for the most part, it does have a lot of the same seals, rods, and so on that the Fleetline flagship product has, uh, but it is the PACCAR private label. It does come with a 1-year, 100,000-mile warranty. Now, on the next slide, we're looking at the TRP gas series shock, and this is that 3-position adjustable shock. It's not gas charged, it's gas cell, so there is actually a baggie in there that takes up the 10% air gap, and that baggie has nitrogen in it. And so that shock right there is it's not susceptible to aeration, which means that the fade performance on that shock stays consistent from start to finish. There's no reduction or increase in fade over the temperature spectrum that truck is driving. Also, the gas, as would be in a traditional gas charge shock, where the gas escapes out of the seal with misting and or the oil in the misting process, this shock here has the gas within a baggie inside, so the gas never escapes, and therefore there's a two-year, 200,000-mile warranty on this. It's also adjustable, so that if you've got, you want a more firm ride or a softer ride, you can adjust these shocks before you put them on to get that. It comes with regular firm and extra firm settings, your choice when you put them on. And then the next slide here actually shows you the gas baggie that is inside of that shock. It's not terribly high tech, but it works really well. It's proprietary technology for us. Been around for 10 years, and we've got a very loyal customer base that likes these shocks. And again, if you have a customer, or if you're somebody that demands more performance, a stiffer ride for whatever reason, this might be a shock that you would check out. And on the next slide, uh, Gabriel.com. We have a wonderful website with cross references, part lookups, videos, marketing support, whatever it is that you would need. I think that the important pieces there are the part lookups, uh, the videos, which are interesting. We've got a whole training program, which I'll jump to in a little bit, but we've got a whole training program for you on there on suspensions. But just know that the site's there for you to utilize, look up whatever it is you need to look up, get the shock number, call Kenworth Northeast with that, and they can help you out with that. Um, but the videos are great, and there's a lot of shock and suspension training on there as well. So the next slide is our technical service line. So if there's any questions on the shocks that you have with fitment, application, stampings, damping forces, anything that comes up with regards to the shocks, you can call this number. We're in Detroit, Michigan, and happy to help 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. Just, that's what these folks do. That's all they do is answer shock questions and get you the information that you need so that, Kenworth Northeast can help you out with that. So please know that number. It's available to you. I also want to point out that on our website, we have something called the Answer Garage, and that is a portal where you can go in, register, and watch short videos, 2 to 5 minutes long, and then take a short quiz afterwards. I think it's 3 to 5 questions long. For each quiz that you pass, you can earn points for hats, t-shirts, golf balls, that sort of thing. Or in fact, you can also, if you take all of the classes, you can get the heat gun that was shown earlier in this presentation. So that is also available for you. So I encourage you to check out Gabriel.com. So the next slide, the key takeaways, just want to review real quick. Shocks are a critical safety component. Shocks are commonly overlooked at inspection. Misting is a natural occurrence and does not indicate failure. Visual inspection is not enough. Always do the heat test. Always replace shocks when replacing air springs or tires. Always replace shocks in pairs. And again, TRP, gas, problem solver shock for the toughest applications. And our toll-free tech service line is 800-999-3903. So with that, I appreciate the time. I don't know if there's any questions or if we want to open it up to questions, but always happy to help.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, I did give everyone the ability to unmute themselves.
Mhm.
Or, like I said, you could pop them into the chat. I will say, just as we're getting to wrap up, first, thank you. You will see a follow up email that has a link to a YouTube video of this training by the end of the week. And then, again, just that reminder, if you're interested in what's happening in the world of heavy duty engines, keep an eye out, check out, register for our September session that's going to be led by the folks from PACCAR and Cummins. These are going to be the people you want to ask all your big questions to. They'll be covering the engine technology itself and then also regulations that are coming in 2025, 2026 as well.